The men of Redstone had a saying: working for Helena Harrington would either make you or finish you. Most found out which one the hard way. It wasn't that she was cruel. Cruel would have been easier to understand. Cruel had edges you could see coming, words you could brace against. Helena was something else entirely. She was precise, exacting. She expected from others exactly what she demanded from herself, which was everything, always, without complaint. And since most men couldn't match that standard, most men didn't last. 3 years she had run Red Crest Ranch alone. 3 years since her father, Edmund Harrington, had stopped being able to walk the land he'd spent his life building. The stroke had come quietly, the way the worst things always do, on an ordinary Tuesday morning while he was pouring his coffee. And Helena had been the one to find him. She had also been the one to decide, in the long, silent hours that followed, that nobody outside these walls would ever know how bad it truly was. Redstone could not know. The creditors could not know. The men who worked the land and the merchants who supplied it could not know. Because the moment they knew Edmund Harrington was finished, they would decide Red Crest Ranch was finished too, and Helena would sooner work herself into the ground than let that happen. So she became the ranch. Every decision, every negotiation, every hard conversation that her father used to handle, she absorbed it all without flinching. She learned to look men twice her age in the eye and speak in a tone that left no room for argument. She learned that softness, even a small, unguarded moment of it, yet was something people remembered and used. So she put it away, locked it somewhere deep and quiet, and told herself she didn't miss it. The hands who worked Red Crest respected her. That much was certain. But respect and comfort are different things, and nobody at Red Crest was ever truly comfortable. They did their work, took their wages, and kept a careful distance. Some lasted a season. A few made it through a full year. None of them stayed longer than that without finding a reason to move on. She never chased any of them, never asked why they left. She simply posted the notice in Redstone and waited for the next one. Gideon Cobb answered the notice on a Wednesday morning in late October. Helena was at the fence line when he arrived, inspecting a section of post that had shifted after the last hard rain. But she heard the horse before she saw the man, a steady, unhurried sound, the kind that belonged to someone who was never in a rush to arrive anywhere. She didn't look up immediately. She had learned that looking up too quickly gave people the impression they had been anticipated. She hadn't anticipated Gideon Cobb. Nobody anticipated Gideon Cobb. When she finally turned, she found a man standing a respectful distance from her fence, hat in hand, waiting without any visible impatience. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in the way that came from real work rather than lack of food, with a stillness about him that was immediately unusual. Most men who came for ranch work arrived with something to prove. You could see it in the set of their shoulders, the way they held their chin. But this man looked like he had already proven everything he needed to and had long since stopped caring about it. "Helena Harrington?" he said. Not Miss Harrington, not ma'am, just her name, said plainly, like a simple statement of fact. "That's right," she said. "Gideon Cobb. I saw your notice." She looked at him the way she looked at everything, directly, without softening it. "You have experience with cattle?" "Yes." "Fence work?" "Yes." "I don't run an easy ranch." "I didn't come looking for easy," he said. There was no performance in it, no attempt to impress her. He said it the same way he might have commented on the weather, as though it were simply a true thing that needed saying and nothing more. Helena had interviewed enough men to know when someone was telling her what she wanted to hear. This didn't feel like that. Yet she hired him on a trial basis. 2 weeks, same as she told everyone. Most men treated the trial period like an audition, working louder than necessary, making sure she noticed every task completed. Gideon worked like she wasn't watching, which, she told herself, was the only reason she found herself watching more than usual. He was methodical, unhurried, but never so slow. He fixed the fence line she had been fighting with for a week in a single afternoon, not by forcing it, but by taking the time to understand why it had shifted in the first place. She had watched from a distance, arms crossed, telling herself she was simply checking on progress. At supper that first evening, the other hands talked and joked the way men do when the day's work is behind them. But Gideon sat at the end of the table and ate his meal and listened more than he spoke. But when old Perch, the oldest hand on Red Crest, a man of few words himself, said something quietly about the weather turning, Gideon nodded and answered in a way that made Perch laugh. A real laugh. The kind Helena hadn't heard from Perch in longer than she could remember. She looked away before either of them noticed her looking. 2 weeks passed. She said nothing about his trial ending. He said nothing about it either. He simply showed up the next morning the way he had shown up every morning, steady, unhurried, asking nothing from her but the work itself. It was on a Thursday evening in his 3rd week that she found the letter. She hadn't been looking for anything, but she had gone to the barn to check on a mare that had been favoring her left foreleg, and she found Gideon there already, crouched beside the horse with a quiet patience that settled the animal in a way Helena's own presence sometimes didn't. He didn't hear her come in, and on the small crate beside him, held open by a worn leather edge, was a letter. Handwritten, the ink faded in places like it had been read and folded and read again more times than anyone should need to read a letter. She didn't read it. She wasn't that kind of woman. But she saw the name at the top before she looked away. Daniel. She didn't know who Daniel was. She didn't ask. But something about the way that letter sat beside him, the careful way it had been placed, like something fragile, stayed with her longer than she wanted it to. After that night, she sat at her father's bedside the way she did every evening, reading to him from whatever book was on the table, keeping her voice steady, even when his eyes didn't quite focus the way they used to. Edmund Harrington had been the loudest presence in any room his entire life. Now he was quiet in a way that still startled her sometimes, even after 3 years. She closed the book and looked at his hands, big, weathered hands that had built everything she was now fighting to keep. And she thought, without meaning to, about a man who read a worn letter alone in a barn. She told herself it meant nothing. But Helena Harrington had spent 3 years being honest about everything except the things that mattered most. And somewhere beneath all that careful armor, that in the place where she had locked away everything soft, something had shifted, just slightly, just enough. The first frost came to Redstone on a Friday night, quiet and indifferent, laying itself across the land like it had every right to be there. By Saturday morning, the water troughs had a thin skin of ice across them, and the hands moved a little slower, breath clouding in the cold air, shoulders hunched against the bite of it. Helena moved the same as always. She was at the barn before anyone else, breaking the ice in the troughs with the butt of a shovel, already 3 tasks deep into her morning before the sun had fully committed to rising. This was how she had always worked, ahead of everything, ahead of everyone, so that nothing could catch her off guard. It was a habit she had built so carefully over the years that it no longer felt like effort. It simply felt like being alive. Gideon arrived at the barn 20 minutes after her, and he took in the broken troughs without comment, picked up a feed bucket, and moved to the far stall without being asked. No acknowledgement of the fact that the work was already half done. No remark about her early start. Just quiet, seamless contribution, like water finding the path of least resistance. It unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite name. Most men acknowledged her effort, even when they didn't mean to. They would glance at the completed work, then at her, and there would be something in their expression, surprise, or a reluctant admiration, or occasionally something that looked uncomfortably close to pity. She had learned to read all of those expressions and hold herself apart from every one of them. But Gideon's expression gave her nothing to hold herself apart from, and he simply worked alongside her as though it were the most natural thing in the world, and that absence of reaction was somehow louder than any reaction she had ever received. She left the barn without speaking. She told herself it was because there was nothing to say. It was Perch who first said something she couldn't ignore. He found her at the supply ledger that afternoon, cross-referencing feed costs against what the next month would demand. Perch was not a man who came to her with small talk. In 4 years of working Red Crest, he had come to her directly exactly 3 times, and each time it had been about something that mattered. So when he appeared in the doorway of the small office off the main house and stood there turning his hat in his hands, she set down her pencil. "Cobb fixed the north pasture gate," Perch said. "I know. I asked him to. He also rehung the barn door, the one that's been dragging since spring." Helena said nothing. She hadn't asked him to do that. "And he reset 2 of the fence posts on the east line, the ones that were heaving from the frost." Perch paused. "Nobody asked him to do any of that either." "Is there a problem with the work?" she asked. "No," Perch said simply. "No problem with the work." He put his hat back on and looked at her with the kind of directness that only came from a man who had nothing left to prove and no fear of consequences. "Just thought you should know what kind of man you've got working your land." He left before she could respond. She sat for a long moment looking at the ledger without reading it. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to the numbers. Why, because the numbers were reliable in a way that most things weren't. She found a reason to ride the east fence line the following morning. She told herself it was an inspection. The frost had been harder the second night, and it was reasonable, practical, even, to check the line herself. She was not riding out there to see the fence posts Gideon had reset. She was certainly not riding out there to see Gideon. He was there when she arrived, moving along the line with the same unhurried efficiency she had come to recognize from a distance. He looked up when he heard her horse, gave a single nod, and went back to his work. She dismounted and walked the line slowly, examining each post with genuine attention, because she was a woman who did not pretend to do things she was actually doing. The work was solid, better than solid, and he had not simply reset the posts. He had read the ground, understood where the frost was likely to push hardest, and set each post accordingly. It would hold through winter without needing attention. She knew enough about fence work to know that kind of thinking was not common. "You've done this before," she said. It wasn't a question. "Some," he said. "Where?" A brief pause. Not uncomfortable exactly, more like a man measuring what was true against what was necessary to say. "Kansas," he said finally. "Had a spread there for a while. Had. Past tense." She noticed it, but didn't pursue it. "You left," she said. "I did." "Why?" He straightened and looked at her then, not defensively, not evasively, but with a steady openness that was somehow harder to face than either of those things would have been. Sometimes a place stops being what it was," he said. "Nothing to do but acknowledge that and move on." It was a careful answer, not dishonest, but not complete either. She recognized that. The art of saying something true while keeping the real thing protected. She had been doing it herself for 3 years. She mounted her horse and rode back toward the ranch without saying anything further. But somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place she reserved for things she didn't want to think about directly, she turned his words over slowly. Sometimes a place stops being what it was. She understood that more than she wanted to. The trouble came, as trouble often did, from the direction she least expected. His name was Randall Moore. He ran the largest competing cattle operation north of Redstone, a wide, prosperous spread that had been quietly absorbing smaller ranches for the better part of a decade. He was not a villain in the way that stories sometimes required. He was simply a practical man with a great deal of money and a habit of acquiring things that other people were struggling to hold on to. He had come to Red Crest once before, 2 years ago, with an offer to buy. Helena had declined without discussion. He had nodded pleasantly and left, and she had understood from the way he left that the conversation was not finished, only postponed. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in November with 2 of his men and an expression of polite concern that didn't reach his eyes. Helena met him at the gate. "Miss Harrington," he said, touching his hat, "just passing through Redstone. I thought I'd stop and pay my respects to your father." "My father isn't receiving visitors," she said. Something moved across Moore's face, quick and controlled, but she caught it. "I heard he'd been under the weather," he said carefully. "Nothing serious, I hope." "He's fine," she said. "Thank you for the concern." Moore looked past her toward the main house with an expression she had seen on men who were calculating something. Then he smiled, a clean, practiced smile, and looked back at her. "You're doing remarkable work out here, Helena. Truly. Running a spread this size alone is no small thing." He paused just long enough for the word alone to settle into the air between them. "My offer from 2 years ago still stands. Better than it stood then, actually." "My answer still stands too," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and then nodded in the same pleasant way he had nodded 2 years ago. "Of course, well, give your father my regards." He turned his horse, and his men followed him back down the road toward Redstone. Helena watched them until they were out of sight. Then she turned and found Gideon standing near the barn, post-hole digger in hand, watching the road with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and more considered than anger. Their eyes met briefly. He looked back at the ground and resumed his work. She stood at the gate a moment longer than she needed to. That evening she sat with her father longer than usual. Edmund was having one of his clearer days, his eyes tracking her movement around the room, his mouth occasionally attempting shapes that didn't quite form into words. On these days, she talked to him more than she did on the difficult ones, filling the silence with the business of the ranch, the state of the herd, the small repairs that had been completed. She didn't tell him about Moore's visit. She never told him about Moore. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, she found herself running out of ranch business to report. And into that silence, before she could stop it, came a different kind of thought entirely. She thought about a man who had once had a spread in Kansas and didn't anymore, who reset fence posts nobody asked him to reset and fixed barn doors that had been dragging since spring, who sat at the end of the table and listened more than he spoke and had somehow made Perch laugh in a way she hadn't heard in years, while who carried a letter with a name on it that she hadn't asked about and couldn't stop thinking about. She looked at her father's hands again, those big, quiet hands that had once known every inch of this land, and she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Not weakness, not sentiment, Just the particular loneliness of a person who has been strong for so long, they've forgotten what it felt like to lean on anything at all. She blew out the lamp and sat in the dark for a while. Outside, somewhere near the bunkhouse, she could hear the low murmur of the hands settling in for the night. She couldn't make out words, but she recognized Gideon's voice among them, low and unhurried, the way it always was. She listened longer than she should have. Then she stood up, straightened her shoulders the way she always did, and went to bed. But sleep took longer than usual to come, and when it did, her dreams were quieter than they had been in years, softer at the edges, less like a woman bracing for the next hard thing, and more like someone who had, without quite deciding to, begun to set something down. She didn't know what it meant yet, but something in her, something old and careful and very, very tired, suspected she was about to find out. Winter settled over Redstone the way it always did, without apology, without ceremony. Just a gradual tightening of the air until the cold was simply the condition of everything. Red Crest Ranch moved with it. The rhythm of the work changed in winter, slower in some ways, more urgent in others. The herd needed more attention, the water more monitoring, the structures more defending against what the season intended to do to them. Helena managed it all with the same precision she brought to everything, adjusting and redistributing the work among her hands with an efficiency that left no room for confusion. Gideon had been at Red Crest for just over 2 months now. She had stopped thinking of him as a trial hire somewhere around the 6th week, though she hadn't said so out loud. She hadn't said much of anything out loud about Gideon Cobb. But the ranch ran differently with him on it, smoother somehow, in ways that were difficult to attribute to any single thing he did. It was more the quality of his presence than the quantity of his labor. He had a way of absorbing tension rather than adding to it, and on a ranch where tension had been the ambient condition for 3 years, that was not a small thing. What she hadn't expected was for that quality to start affecting her directly. It happened gradually, the way most things that matter actually happen, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small ones that you only recognize later as having meant something. It was the morning he brought her coffee without being asked, setting it on the fence post beside her while she was reviewing the herd count, and walking away before she could decide whether to thank him or tell him she didn't need it. She drank it. It was exactly the right temperature. She didn't ask how he knew how she took it. It was the afternoon she was arguing with a merchant from Redstone over a supply price that had been quietly raised without discussion, and she turned to find Gideon standing just within earshot, not intervening, not offering anything, just present, in a way that felt oddly like standing on solid ground. It was the evening Perch's horse threw a shoe 2 miles from the ranch in failing light, and Gideon had already saddled a spare and was riding out before anyone had finished explaining the situation. None of these things were extraordinary. Any decent ranch hand might have done any one of them, but Gideon did all of them, consistently, without acknowledgement, without expectation, and slowly, quietly, without Helena's permission, they began to dismantle something she had spent years carefully constructing. She didn't like it. She also couldn't seem to stop it. The conversation about Daniel happened on a Sunday. The hands had the afternoon to themselves, a rare concession Helena made once a month, because she understood that men needed rest even when ranches didn't. Most of them rode into Redstone. Perch sat on the bunkhouse step and whittled. Gideon stayed behind, which surprised her, and spent the first part of the afternoon making small repairs to the tack room that nobody had scheduled. She found him there when she came to check on her father's horse. That's an old gray gelding that Edmund had raised from a foal and that Helena couldn't bring herself to sell no matter how practical that decision might have been. Gideon was oiling a bridle when she came in. He glanced up and nodded, and went back to his work. She attended to the gray, and for a while, there was just the quiet of the tack room, the smell of leather and oil and cold air coming under the door, and it was the most at ease she had felt inside a building in longer than she could remember. She didn't plan what she said next. That was the only explanation she ever found for why she said it. "The letter," she said. "The one in the barn. The name on it was Daniel." Gideon's hand stilled on the bridle, just for a moment. Then he continued working, and when he spoke, his voice was the same as it always was, level, unhurried, and like a man who had made peace with the thing he was about to say. "My son," he said. The tack room was very quiet. "He died," Gideon said. 4 years ago. He was 6 years old." He paused, and in that pause was the entire weight of something that no amount of patience or steadiness could make light. "Fever. Came on fast. There wasn't much the doctor could do." Another pause. "My wife. She couldn't stay on the ranch after that. Too much of him in every corner of it. I understood that. We tried for a while, but some losses change the shape of a person so completely that who you were together doesn't fit anymore." He set the bridle down and looked at his hands. "She went to live with her sister in Missouri. I sold the spread and started moving." Helena said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved across the roof of the tack room with a low, hollow sound. "I'm sorry," she said finally, and she meant it in the way that people mean it when sorry is entirely insufficient, and they say it anyway, because there is simply nothing else. Gideon nodded once. "The letter is the last one he dictated to me," he said quietly. "He was just learning his letters. He wanted to write to his grandfather, but he couldn't manage all the words yet, so he told me what to say. And I wrote it down." A brief stillness. "I never sent it. Didn't seem right to send it after." Helena looked at the old gray gelding, at his patient, ancient eyes, and felt something move through her chest that she couldn't have named if she'd tried. "My father had a stroke," she said, and it was the first time she had said those words plainly to anyone outside the ranch. 3 years ago. He can't run the ranch anymore. He can barely speak." She kept her eyes on the horse. "Nobody in Redstone knows how bad it is. I've kept it that way because the moment they know, everything my father built becomes something people feel entitled to have opinions about, and I won't have that." Gideon said nothing. He didn't rush to fill the silence with comfort or advice or any of the things people usually reached for when someone handed them a difficult truth. He simply received it, the way he received everything, without flinching, without looking away. "That's a heavy thing to carry alone," he said finally. "Yes," she said simply. "It is." They stayed in the tack room a little longer, neither of them speaking, and it was the most honest Helena Harrington had been with another living person in 3 years. It didn't feel like weakness. It didn't feel like the loss of something. It felt, unexpectedly and almost frighteningly, like the opposite. Moore came back in December. This time he didn't bother with pleasantries about her father. He came with a lawyer and a set of documents and the particular confidence of a man who believed he had found a lever. Somewhere, Helena never discovered exactly where, he had learned enough about Edmund's condition to feel certain that Red Crest was more vulnerable than it appeared. He laid his offer on the table in the front room of the main house and watched her face with careful eyes. Helena looked at the documents without touching them. Then she looked at Moore. "Who told you about my father?" she said. Information moves in a town like Redstone," he said pleasantly. "It does," she agreed. "So does something else." She stood. "I'd like you to leave my property." "Helena." "Mr. Moore." Her voice was the same voice she had been using for 3 years, the one with no edges to catch hold of, no give anywhere in it. You are sitting in my house with documents I did not invite, and information you obtained without my consent. You will leave now, or I will have every hand on this ranch assist you in doing so. Moore looked at her for a long moment. Then he gathered his documents and stood. The offer won't stay on the table indefinitely, he said. I know, she said. I'm not asking it to. She walked him to the door herself and watched him ride away. And this time when she turned around, Gideon was not near the barn. He was standing on the porch, just directly behind her, close enough that she nearly walked into him. She looked up at him. How long have you been standing there? She said. Long enough, he said. And then, because Helena Harrington had been alone with something too heavy for one person for 3 years, and because Gideon Cobb was the first man she had ever met who didn't need her to be anything other than exactly what she was, she did something she hadn't done since the morning she found her father on the kitchen floor. She let out a long, slow breath and closed her eyes for just a moment. Gideon didn't say anything. He didn't reach for her or offer words that would have been wrong, regardless of how well-intentioned. He simply stayed where he was, solid and unhurried and present, and let her have the moment in full. When she opened her eyes, he was still there. Thank you, she said quietly. Nothing to thank me for, he said. But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Spring came to Red Crest the way it always came to that part of the territory, slowly at first, then all at once, the land shifting from gray and hardened to something softer and full of intention almost overnight. Edmund Harrington had a good stretch in March, several weeks where his eyes were clear more often than not, and his hands had some of their old steadiness back. Helena read to him every evening, and on the best nights he would squeeze her hand twice when she finished a chapter, which was the signal they had worked out between them that meant he wanted her to continue. On one of those evenings, she told him about Gideon. Not everything, just the shape of it. Who he was, how he worked, what kind of man he had turned out to be. Edmund listened with his clear eyes, and when she finished, he looked at her for a long moment and squeezed her hand. Once, which was the signal that meant he understood. She didn't know how much he understood, but it was enough. Gideon asked her to walk with him on an April evening when the last of the frost was gone from the ground, and the air had that particular quality it only had in spring, clean and full of something unspoken. They walked the fence line of the east pasture, the one he had reset in October, and the posts stood exactly as he had placed them. Solid, true, undisturbed by everything the winter had thrown at them. He didn't make a speech. He wasn't that kind of man. He simply stopped walking at the corner post and turned to her and said, I'm not going anywhere, Helena. Good, I want you to know that. Not unless you ask me to. She looked at him, this quiet, patient, deeply human man who had lost everything that mattered and still found a way to show up every morning without bitterness, and she felt the last of something old and protective and exhausting finally release its hold on her. I'm not asking you to, she said. He nodded, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it did when he was allowing himself something he didn't usually allow. She reached out and took his hand, not dramatically, not with any of the ceremony that the moment might have warranted in a different kind of story. Just a simple, deliberate, unhurried reaching, the way he did everything, and he folded his fingers around hers like it was the most natural thing in the world. But they stood at the corner post as the sun went down over Red Crest Ranch, and the land stretched out around them in every direction, wide and honest and full of everything that still needed doing. They married in June. A small ceremony, just the hands and a few people from Redstone that Helena had allowed close enough over the years to count as something like friends. Perch stood up for Gideon. Edmund Harrington sat in a chair brought out from the main house and wore his good jacket and watched his daughter with eyes that were clear and full. When the preacher finished and Gideon looked at her, steady and unhurried and entirely himself, Helena felt something she realized she had been moving toward for a very long time without knowing it. Not the end of something, the beginning. They built it together after that. The ranch, the life, and the particular language that two people develop when they have both survived hard things and chosen each other anyway. Gideon learned every inch of Red Crest the way he learned everything, patiently, thoroughly, with deep respect for what had come before him. Helena learned, slowly and without fanfare, what it felt like to put something down at the end of the day instead of carrying it through the night. Edmund passed in the autumn of that year, quietly, in his own bed, with Helena beside him. It was the kind of ending that was also a kind of mercy, the land he loved still standing, still producing, in the hands of people who understood what it had cost him. She buried him on the East Ridge, where he had always said the view was best. Gideon stood beside her and held her hand through all of it. The following spring, and Helena found an old letter in the tack room, the one with Daniel's name on it, sitting where it always sat, worn at the edges, read more times than paper was ever meant to be read. She left it where it was. Some things deserved their place. That same spring, she told Gideon there would be a child by winter. He was very still for a moment, the particular stillness of a man receiving something he had stopped allowing himself to hope for. Then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before and has never quite found words for since. They named the boy Edmund Daniel Cobb. He had his grandfather's hands. If you find yourself drawn to stories that take their time, where the feeling builds slowly and the people feel real, there are more waiting for you here. Each one is different. Each one is worth the watch.